You might have heard about children in Gaza going missing, kidnapped by Israeli soldiers. It's so evil, it sounds utterly absurd. But Israel's done this kind of thing before. I'm talking about a mass kidnapping that happened when Israel declared itself a state, when thousands of children disappeared and never returned. But they weren't Palestinian, they were Jewish.
It started as a rumor. Later on, it became a myth.
What is considered to be one of the largest cover-ups in the history of Israel.
This horrific crime and its cover-up tell us everything we need to know about Zionism and the core philosophy that's connected to every other colonial reality in the world. Let me explain.
Israel's independence.
It's 1948. Zionist militias have just razed hundreds of Palestinian villages, displaced 750,000 Palestinians, and declared Israel a state. At this stage, there are about 650,000 Jews living there. A minority were Palestinian Jews who'd been living there for ages, but the majority were recent settlers who'd moved to Palestine as part of the Zionist project. And most of these old-timers, as they'd come to be known, were Central or Eastern European, or what's called Ashkenazi Jews. They pioneered the Zionist movement, made up the militias that orchestrated the Nakba, and served in Israel's first political parties and government. Now that they had succeeded in establishing a Zionist state, they needed to start filling it with more settlers. All these European Jews weren't enough to colonize and work all the land that they had taken. If Israel wanted to be a viable state, it would need more Jews. So the Zionist entity had to look to the Arab world. See, there had always been Arab Jews living in Yemen, Iraq, Libya, Syria, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, Egypt, as well as in non-Arab countries like Iran and Turkey. But these Jews, Mizrahi Jews as they'd come to be known, came from a very different context. Ashkenazi Jews had been facing anti-Semitism, pogroms, and persecution in Europe for centuries, which is the environment that gave birth to the colonial Zionist project, and the feeling that there needed to be a Jewish homeland for Jewish safety in the first place. Mizrahi Jews, on the other hand, had been coexisting with their neighbors for centuries, and were part of society. But the colonial creation of Israel ruptured these centuries-old relations, leading to Israeli rescue missions that airlifted them into the colony. And the story behind the huge covered-up crime this video is about starts with one rescue in particular. Operation Magic Carpet. Yes, that is the actual name.
Here is a place where a miracle occurred. 5,000 Jews escaping terror and slavery in the backward Arab state of Yemen.
Yemeni Jews weren't slaves. They were just poor, like most non-Jewish Yemenis were. In fact, Yemeni Jews had been living there for centuries and had chosen to move to Israel because they wanted to flee poverty and had bought into the biblical narrative. Meanwhile, in Israel, these Yemeni Jews were seen as unclean, primitive, backwards, and a threat to the European civilized image that Israel was trying to build. Ben-Gurion, Israel's prime minister at the time, had described Mizrahi Jews as rabble and would later say, "We don't want Israelis to become Arabs. It is incumbent upon us to struggle against the spirit of the Levant, which corrupts individuals and societies." But the Yemenis were still brought in. Why? One Zionist leader said that while Ashkenazi Jews were better suited for city work, Yemeni Jews would do well with agriculture because they, quote, need very little. They'd been tested already, decades before. Yemeni Jews had been brought in by early Zionist settlers when they realized they couldn't work the land well, and they had glowing reviews. Hence, Operation Magic Carpet. Israel took what was essentially the mass import of cheap labor and spun it into an Orientalist white savior story of rescue and redemption.
And with each step you pass from the dark ages to the present century, from bondage to freedom.
This racist, supremacist attitude Ashkenazis had towards Mizrahi Jews sets the scene for what happens next. These are the absorption camps where almost 50,000 Yemeni Jews were sent once they arrived in Israel. Tent cities with awful sanitation, where their belongings were taken, they were secularized, and forced to adopt new Hebrew names, abandon their languages and their culture. Ben-Gurion said, "The aim of the government is to inculcate the Yemeni immigrant with Israeli values to the point where he forgets where he came from." So Yemeni Jews were seen as people who needed to be civilized into the Israeli way of being, but at the same time, as a people who would, quote, never fully achieve modernity. This turned them into infants in the eyes of the Ashkenazi absorbers, thus taking over every decision regarding Mizrahim and their children seemed natural. That brings us to the kidnapping. Between 1948 and the early 1950s, thousands of babies disappeared. This happened to lots of non-European Jewish families, but the majority were Yemeni. It happened in several ways. When Yemeni Jews arrived at the absorption camps, their babies were taken from them forcefully to structures called baby houses, under the pretense that these places were in better condition than the unhygienic camps. And from these baby houses, many children disappeared. Or they disappeared from hospitals when taken there for routine treatment. There were also cases of Yemeni mothers giving birth, their child being taken away by a nurse, and then never seen again.
ילדתי חתול, ככה עכבר, מה ילדתי? תראו לי אותו. למה אתם לא מראים לי כלום? גברת זרקנו. במילים האלה, גברת זרקנו.
Across each scenario, the story was pretty much the same. Parents were told their child had died, but were shown no body, no grave, and no death certificate.
בחיים שלי אני לא מרגישה שהוא מת.
Many of these parents believed that their children had not died, but had been taken away from them, and put up for adoption, or sold to childless Ashkenazi couples.
אמרתי לו, אוקיי, בסדר, מת, אז תני לי לראות אותו פעם אחת, וזהו. ללטף אותו, לעשות לו משהו. היא עושה לי לא.
For years, these families campaigned for the truth and for justice, but were met with claims of myth and conspiracy. Decades later, some people were able to reconnect with their missing children through DNA tests.
After years of research, he found his biological mother, who was told, he says, that he had died during birth. He never told his adoptive parents he knew. They were Holocaust survivors.
Eventually, testimonies from those involved surfaced. One former senior nurse testified that Yemeni parents were not interested in their children, and that they should have been happy that their child got a good education. Another nurse told a Yemeni woman, "You have lots of children. Why not let us take one of them?"
נלקחו שם ילדים לאימהות צעירות מאוד שבאו ללדת, פשוט נעלמו הילדים, הם הוזמנו.
There are plenty of damning testimonies gathered by an NGO called Amram that suggest that this was systematic and widespread. And yet, 3 different government commissions over the course of decades claimed that most children had died, and that there was no evidence the state was involved. During one of these investigations, requests for birth and burial records disappeared, reported to have been destroyed by fires or floods. That coincidence was not investigated, and hundreds of thousands of documents from that inquiry were then classified. Only in 2016 was this issue finally acknowledged at the state level.
White people met here colored people and were supposed to be the same nation. They saw them as a problem that needs to be solved, and part of the solution was to take the children out. They will have a better life. Their identity will not be Middle Eastern. They will be sort of Europeans with dark skin.
It's a horrifying story, but it's not unique. Colonizers across the world have done this. From Australia to Canada to Belgium to France, the forcible removal of children and their re-education is standard practice for colonizers, and it's because despite their distance and space from one another, all these places share one core philosophy: white supremacy. It doesn't matter that the Mizrahi Jews were also settlers there to colonize the indigenous Palestinian population. They weren't white, and that made them vulnerable to their own cultural genocide. The story of the Yemeni children speaks to the only core principle of Zionism that matters, that it is inherently racist and violent against Palestinians and Jews alike. Zionism was invented by victims of white supremacy as their own version of white supremacy, where they could hold top rank. This story is just one of many that shatter the myth of Israel as a utopia and safe haven for Jews. Mizrahi Jews were safe before, and endangered upon their arrival to the white supremacist colony that saw them as nothing more than a primitive labor force. And that's the other thing that needs to be mourned in this story, the identity of the Arab Jew. That's at the core of why they were looked down upon by European settlers, because before being Jews, they were Arabs. The word Mizrahi, meaning Eastern, only serves to cover up this reality, that these were Arab Jews who culturally, linguistically, historically, had more in common with the Palestinians they were colonizing than the white settlers they were doing it alongside or under. And so a system was born to keep them subjugated and dilute them of their culture, so they'd be far removed enough to see Palestinians as more of the other than the European settler who had always seen them as inferior. And so when we hear stories about Palestinian children being kidnapped in Gaza, this is not surprising. This is the extension and continuation of a long-held policy that the Zionist entity was built on.